Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. We welcome you to AAPI Communities in Conversation, a series of live online conversations between writers, creators, and librarians that centers Asian American and Pacific Islander voices, books, cultures, and experiences. This monthly program is hosted by the University of South Carolina's Augusta Baker Endowed Chair, Publishers Weekly, and Penguin Random House Library Marketing. My name is Jaena Rae. I'm a branch manager here in San Francisco at the Ocean View San Francisco Public Library, where I coordinate programs and events with a focus on Filipino culture, arts and crafts, and digital literacy. I'm extremely thrilled to be here today and honored to introduce our special guest, Gina Apostol, with her virtuosic debut novel set in 1980s Manila, winner of the Philippine National Book Award, and now available for the first time in the United States from Soho Press. Gina, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a huge honor and delight to see you, Jaena, and to be with everyone here.
Our library and publishing friends and colleagues are extremely excited to meet and hear from you. So I just wanted to get started and see if you wanted to give us a little bit of background information on Bibliolepsy.
Yeah, Bibliolepsy is my very first novel. I began it when I was around 19 years old. And I began it to talk about something that was so powerful for me. Everyone says, write what you know. And what I knew was reading. I loved reading. I grew up practically in libraries because I was always being punished for not wearing my necktie, or my uniform was crumpled or something. I went to a Catholic school, and my school's punishment was to send me to the library. So it was great. So this habit of reading, this love for reading, I wanted to write about. I wanted to figure out why it was so important to me, and even just to describe it, to describe a love for books. So I created this character, Preemie. Her original name was Premie Paragraph, but I thought that was corny, so that's not her name anymore. But her name was Preemie, whose main focus is really the love of books. And but the time that I began writing this novel was actually a time of political turmoil in the Philippines. It was 1983. A senator was killed on the airport tarmac, it turns out, by the dictator's goons. And it turned into 1983 to 1986, turned into this very fascinating time in Philippine history. So I combined the world of books of that was my reason for writing, with the political turmoil that happened that eventually kicked out the dictator and his family. Unfortunately, they're returning. So the book puts together this very personal world of reading with the world of politics that occurred as I was writing it.
That's so interesting. I'm taking some Philippine studies classes at City College of San Francisco. So I took Philippine history and we went over that period of time in the Philippines. So I was wondering, the Philippines has always been a place of political turmoil, it seems like, from what I've been learning. And what do you see are some of the parallels between the Philippines from that time when you wrote the book to today, with like Duterte and all of that going on?
Well, it's in one sense, it's pretty horrendous, in that the world of the Marcos regime was definitely a dark time for Filipinos. And 1986 was a time where there was this beautiful resistance, very public, very, in my view, very organized. And I thought really a spontaneous rebellion, where of course there were these organized forces that were helping it to really come to fruition, to really make it more focused on on the history and analysis of why this dictator was in power. So that was a time of both darkness and, I thought, amazing analytic rebellion, in my view. And here we have another person who's using Marcos tactics to kill, to take over democratic institutions, to find a way to remain in power. He's doing this now. The Duterte group is now combining with the Marcos group. And I would say arguably the Marcos group was always part of the Duterte group. You can see it from the way one of the first things the Duterte government did was bury Marcos in Heroes Cemetery. I mean, that was one of the first things this Duterte government did. So there's a huge, I think, alliance with the money and power of the Marcoses under Duterte. Now, unfortunately, now, given that not so recent history of rebellion and resistance, we have the likely installation of the Marcos son as president, and he's way ahead in the polls, and there's a reason for that. It's systemic. It's still an oligarchic government that is run by political dynasties, families that have been in power, landowners forever. Since the American regime, I would say the American regime very much promoted these political dynasties. And so I'm hoping that the spirit of resistance still matters now, but it is very interesting to see how the problems of the Philippines at the time, the oligarchic violence that we were fighting in 1986, remains a problem now.
Right. It's really fascinating following the nominations and the presidential nominees in the Philippines.
And there's a woman. There is a woman who's running for office. Whom I'm just gonna say I'm voting for her. Who is a lawyer? She's a lawyer for. She was a social justice lawyer. Her husband was a very good. Again, she's a widow, like Cory Aquino, but very different from Cory Aquino. She is of the lower middle classes. Cory Aquino was of the land owning classes, and so that was a kind of problematic aspect of Aquino, whereas she's of the lower middle classes. And so there's that similarity too, you know.
Yeah, it's really interesting how history just seems to repeat itself. It's very cyclical in some ways.
Resistance too, though. Resistance too has been repeated and has cycled back, and so that's also, I always think about that, the possibility of resistance.
So getting back to bibliolepsy, the character Preemie seems so unconcerned with what's going on around her. What does this say about her political and cultural identities and how she sees herself in her world?
Yeah, there's definitely, I think with Preemie, the reader has to be very clear about her class orientation, her class condition. And I thought I made it clear also, except that Preemie herself would not be as aware of how class conditions her, of how the bourgeois world created by colonization conditions her and created her. It doesn't make sense for Preemie to be aware, but the reader should be looking at those signifiers of class and colonization in Preemie. Her grandfather was an American pharmacy owner. Her grandmother is a Spanish landowner. Her father is interesting. Her father is Chinese, and her mother is this mix. So you have a whole world of kind of Filipino history in that very kind of a shortcut of Philippine history in her family lineage. And her lack of interest or her seeming cultural indifference to the political situation does not mean that the reader shouldn't be aware of how she's being formed. At the same time, there's that split in the novel, and I think there's that split in Premie as well, of her recognition of her desire. And I think that's really important, even when you're thinking about colonization and history, the desire of the individual and how that desire comes through and the expression of that desire. And so I think that centering of her own desire is something for us to also think about, even in a political world. She is centering her desire. She has absolute agency. She does whatever fuck she wants, you know, and she's mainly fucky. And so I think that too is important, that she is an audacious individual who understands what she wants. She may not understand her full political, the full political nature of the world around her, but her attention to her desire, I think is beautiful, and I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. She's so unlike what I was told to be as I grew up. She's like total opposite, and it's just really cool to see her just go so just so single-mindedly in her with her desires. It's amazing, and it's really like you said, fascinating, because I think as women we're not often, there's a double standard, right? With women, we can't be that direct in what we in our desires sometimes.
Could I say this though? I didn't grow up in the States. I grew up in the Philippines. And my centering of my desire, or my centering of Premie's desire in the novel, is so much the way I saw my mother and her sisters, and the way they dealt with the world. They were like, we are in charge. Don't, you know, so if you're dealing with, I think my mom was definitely in charge of my family. Her sisters were in charge of their marriages. And there's definitely domestic abuse in the Philippines. There's definitely misogyny and all of those things. But there's also, I thought, growing up, watching my mother and her sisters navigate the world, there was a centering of their desire that I thought was so fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. Why did you, how do I want to phrase this? Why did you make sex like one of her main desires?
Yeah.
What is that? What is the role that plays for Preemie and in the book?
Yeah, in a writerly form, in terms of formalism, it gives her a plot. So that's one, you know, sex is a plot. And I actually began to understand this as a novelist, that in order to create movement and action, especially for any of your protagonists, the movement into romance, into sex or romance, is really kind of almost an instant way to get reader interest and to get plot going. So on one hand, there's something very formalist and kind of structuralist about that approach of using romance. I did it too in Gun Dealer's Daughter. She had to have something happening, so she had a romance with this upper class boy. So there's a plot issue there. It allowed me to have her move from one guy to another. But the other thing there is, for me, and I don't know if I can explain this very clearly, but because it's something that I do in my novels, because I don't think I can really articulate it in life or without the novel, is I think that the correlation between the body and the body politic is so powerful that we can't imagine the worker, we can't imagine political movement without thinking about the body at the heart of that movement, without thinking about the human body. And sex, for me, brings in the human body, brings in the bodily desire that I think is part of politics. If you think about bibliolepsy, and it's I almost see the movement into rebellion by the Manila forces, by the people in Manila at the time, in terms of an orgasmic kind of fruition, like the rebellion is like the movement into resistance, and rebellion is orgastic, the orgastic green light of Gatsby, for instance. And so that there's a concatenation of orgasmic spasms that is the kind of the movement into revolt. And I think there's something there that we need to recognize about politics, that politics is libidinal, that there's a kind of the eroticism of power is also should be moved into the eroticism of resistance and people's movement, people power. And I think I'm interested in that. I'm interested in that thing that's hard for me to explicate.
Her sister Preemie also has several relationships. And how does the juxtaposition between Preemie and her sister Anna, how do I want to phrase this? Just like, what role does Anna play in Preemie's life? Like her example?
That's a beautiful question, Jaena, because it just came to me as you were asking that question, and I didn't think about it before, because you know what? No one ever asked me about Anna. I think she's so interesting. And Anna, so she's definitely a figure of aspiration for me, in terms of the person who just, for sheer beauty, just does. Her beauty is actually part of the book, and Filipinos and beauty, that's something to think about, that political issue of Filipinos and beauty. But she also, like Preemie, does whatever she wants. So these are two women who do whatever they want. But Preemie is in this like physical erotic mode, and Anna moves into a spiritual mode. She's a spiritista. I don't know if you know spiritistas in your life. My sister always went to she went to palmistry, the palm readings, and Filipinos really believe in this, the world of supernatural, the world of the spirits. And that world, the EDSA world, the world of rebellion in 1986, there were so many people that were doing these, I went to them, prayer rallies, where you're praying itself, the energy of praying was supposed to make the mass movement happen and make Marcus go away. This belief in spiritual movement. And there was a lot of that in the rebellion. So there were many different ways that politics was being engendered and imagined in that rebellion. There were the Spiritistas, there were the Catholics, there were a lot of Catholics, there were a lot of crosses, there were a lot of like the divine aspect there. This is true. Halley's Comet was over the Philippines in that week. Halley's Comet. So of course everyone's going, wow, this is really part of divine plan, stuff like that. So Anna is part of that divine aspect of people, of the way Filipinos deal with politics. Because look at it. Jose Rizal is adored as an actual god like Jesus among certain Filipinos. There's a sect, they're called Rizalistas. Jose Rizal being the national hero, who is a novelist. For those of you who may not know, the Filipinos revere Rizal as the national hero. His statue is everywhere. And there's an actual sect, the Rizalistas, on this mountain, Banahaw. So that divine, spiritual, supernatural aspect of Filipino belief is in Anna. I thought, that's what I thought. And that's what came to mind when you asked that question, because you were asking about sex, and Preemie is about that bodily aspect. But Anna, she becomes the prophet of the rebellion. And there were definitely those people in 1986.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was amazing. Yeah, I really enjoyed Anna's character too. I thought she was really fascinating in the fact that she was so physically beautiful, but she was more interested in beyond that.
She was not interested in her beauty and in the physical world in a weird way. Mm-hmm. Whereas she was always moved into that space. She rejected it.
Okay. Yeah. Now that this book, Bibliolepsy, is coming out, what do you want readers of today to take away from the book itself, and also just if people are unfamiliar with the Philippines, what do you want people to take away about the Philippines from this book?
I think for me, I think it's important that people see the book really centers Premie's world, centers the world of Leyte, even a very small world in the Philippines, the world of Tacloban. I mean, no one in the Philippines would really even be centering Tacloban in their world. But she centers what is herself in the world, however seemingly not seen that world might be. So I think I'd like people to really see this text as a text that centers its world. It is not centering, and I don't think I have a novel that centers the world, let's say, of being America, because I didn't grow up here, and I didn't grow up with that centering. And it is, I think, for us here in America, a powerful thing to be open to and to see this world in which your cultural references are probably not going to be the center. And yet, because of the world of colonization and the history of imperialism, you will also see your world in it. Because if you're going to look at the books that Preemie reads, they're very white. You know, they're very, and why is that? Imperialism, violence, colonization. And it would be important to recognize that this centering of this Filipino world is also a way to mirror and see your world. I think they're both. It's a dialectical piece when you're reading works, these Anglophone books. There's this Anglophone world of writers in English who are in fact not American, you know, or not of the West. So.
Yeah, it was interesting to see the books that Preemie was reading. I imagine you've read all of those books as well.
Yeah.
At some point. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I wish I had included so many more now that I think about it, but yeah.
What would you include? What else would you include?
Oh, well, I would include books that were really interesting to me as a child, but don't, like among the Russians, for instance, I really liked Nikolai Leskov. I really liked, and even those weird things that I would read, like the knowledge that I had at the time, which was kind of really small knowledge, like very narrow notions, very narrow details of, you know, how Dostoevsky married Anna Snitkina, you know, the typist of Crime and Punishment. I think I mentioned her a little bit in Bibliolepsy, or the world of Borges. You know, just the people who, like, for instance, the world of Borges, the women who supported Borges. For instance, his I think Maria Kodama, that was his wife, the Japanese lady that he married at the end. Just to think about them as the people, the readers of these texts, who created these texts too, or, you know, Victorio Campo, Silvino Campo, the Argentines who were early readers of the so-called Sur, the South American novel. So what I would have wanted was to really include more of those women readers that I already knew about when I was young, but it's interesting to me that I didn't.
Yeah, I was going to ask, you were so young when you wrote this book, but you were already so well read at that time, it feels like. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's another thing that I think people need to recognize about the Filipino bourgeoisie. It's like, this is the bourgeois world. This is not like, I'm not talking about every single Filipino, but the bourgeois intellectual world of the Philippines is hugely eclectic, hugely learned, and and so my novels end up seeming like, wow, that's so it's so odd. But if you're actually talking with Filipinos in the Philippines who go to school, who go to college, I mean, those are people who know everything from Jacques Lacan to Lacandula, you know. So
That's kind of intimidating because US education isn't that. I mean, yeah, it's not
I was
that.
educated at the University of the Philippines, and if you notice, my novel has a lot of that education in it, University of the Philippines, and it was definitely an education that was so big, you know, because you go there, you're 16 when you go to school, and so 16, 17, you're reading this text that they make you read, which is a compilation, a compendium of world literature. And you don't know what you're getting into, but it's so powerful to me that the works that I ended up knowing, which goes from, let's say, you know, obviously Chinua Achebe to, you know, to the pillow books of China, to the world of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just so big, you know, the world of the existentialist Unamuno, you know, the Spanish existentialist, to the world of, as I pointed out, the post-structuralist world of Derrida. So, which comes later, not early, but it's just it's a very what you call this, Catholic education with a small c. Catholic as in very big, very broad.
Who are some writers that you like, contemporary writers now, that you would include, that you might have included in bibliolepsy?
Contemporary?
Like anybody you're reading right now, you might have included?
Well, the thing about that is that here's the huge gap that I learned from coming to America, and that's why this is my education in America. My education in America is in Black literature. It was so colonized, but again, but third world, you know, like we called it third world. It was called third world studies. That's not the term they use anymore. It was at the same time colonized, at the same time global. But that actually made a very interesting gap, which is Black American writing. We did not have. We didn't have Toni Morrison. We only had James Baldwin. That's what I remember. I remember James Baldwin. I remember reading his essays, I think Stranger, his Stranger essay, some essays from Notes of a Native Son, I think. But Toni Morrison, no, or even contemporary, really fascinating work like Ishmael Reed. Those, even if you're talking about, I did not read Ralph Ellison as a, we were required to read American lit, but Invisible Man was not on that list. But I had to read American lit. I had, as an English major, that was required. I had to take 2 classes in American lit before, up to 1850, and then after that, which would have been 1930, 1850 to 1930. But you know, so I think Black America is what was really missing there. Which is really weird because, to be honest, the connection between Philippine history and Black America is so powerful. For instance, the person who promulgated Black History Month, Carter G. Woodson, was a superintendent in the Department of, he was an education superintendent in the Philippines in the aftermath of the Philippine-American War. And he saw how Filipinos were being educated by America. And he wrote The Miseducation of the Negro, based on his recognition of how he thought, oh, so that's how we were educated, by being in the Philippines as a dominator in the Philippines. So he was a colonizer, but he understood. He was in the colonizer group, and he understood how he had been educated, how Black Americans were being educated from being a colonizer in the Philippines. So there's a very huge connection, but you have to understand the power of American hegemony in the Philippines in the aftermath of the Philippine-American Wars. The violence becomes very obvious when you see how powerful their grip on the Philippines was after the Philippine-American War. And you can see that in the books that are in BIBLIOLEPSY. I actually ended up, after doing BIBLIOLEPSY, I was working on this other novel during the pandemic. And because I had to read BIBLIOLEPSY for this publication, these thoughts that I have right now about the connection between colonization and the books that I read bleed into that other novel, the one that I just finished.
I wanted to know your thoughts on the apparent resurgence of book banning and the pushback on critical race theory, and how those things affect culture and education, and just your thoughts in general about that, since it's in the forefront. Like, I know that Mouse was just banned in Tennessee and so on.
Yeah, I think obviously for me, it is an assault on American culture. It's an assault on American education, on everyone's culture and everyone's education. And it is an assault on libraries and librarians. It's an assault on the publishing industry. It's an assault on writers and artists. And it's an assault on readers. So I think it's violent. I think these laws are violent. They're acts of violence and aggression against their own culture and their own good. So I do see it also as, I see it this way. I see it in this dialectical way. I see it as a sign, actually, a signifier of the power of Black resistance and Black thought, the power of Black Lives Matter. I think it is white backlash. I really do see it as, it's what happened after Reconstruction. It's white backlash. It's what happened after the civil rights, after the 60s, where you just have these forces that are very powerful, very moneyed, forces of capitalism, racial capitalism, whose resources are still theirs. They have hoarded all of these resources to assault their fellow Americans. And that's what they're doing with these laws. And I think our job, my job as a writer, is to keep saying and talking about my resistance to these forms of violence, and to have them and to recognize that this form of violence comes from the fact that the moral authority of Black Lives Matter is that powerful. So they have to codify into law their violence against their people. It's a lot of fear.
It is. It's a lot of fear.
It's horrific.
It is. It is.
And I don't think we should see it as just a joke, like DeSantis is a joke or these people are jokes. They are jokes in a Freudian sense. They're jokes in the sense that jokes are violent. Jokes are forms of violence and aggression.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that writing, reading, and teaching are can be considered acts of resistance? Yes,
absolutely. It's why I keep doing it. It's why I keep teaching. It's why actually I teach younger people. I don't teach creative writing. I find creative writing very problematic. For me, it's a very kind of self-interest kind of thing. But teaching reading to young people, I love doing that. It's just, for me, really heartening to find ways of making younger Americans, because they're all Americans in my classes here in New York, see the link between their reading now and the history and patterns of cultural rebellion and resistance that they could do. Because it's also true that even as these violent forces are there have always been beautiful acts of resistance throughout the history of this country. And they have been done by, I will say, the indigenous people. It's the history of the resistance of the indigenous. It's the history of the resistance of African Americans. They're the people that have created democracy in this country. And we need to keep moving into the space that they have offered us.
How would, see, how do I want to phrase this question? What is our role as Asian Americans, as Pacific Islander Americans? What is our role in all of this? Like, how should we support these movements? And I mean, we're part of it as well.
We are part of it. And I think we need to see our history as part of the history of that. Part of the history of the imperialism, the capitalist world that has also produced indigenous resistance, that has been resisted by African Americans. And we are part of that. We are part of the system that has also, if you look at the history of Asian America, for instance, which begins, let's say, with with the Morro Bay, you know, the arrival, it's 1571 or something like that.
Something, I can't remember exactly.
The sailors who escaped, the Filipino sailors who escaped their ship. It was one of the galleon ships. So they escaped the galleon ship. So that's part of that imperial global world of empire. They escape it. They try to be, they end up fighting indigenous groups in Morro Bay in California. And so they're both, it's an interesting kind of liminal space maybe, or I don't think it's even liminal. I think it's really central of your part as both victim and part of the colonizer world, that because you're victim, you become part of this, you become entwined in the colonizer world. And it's very early in American history. It's very early in the history of even indigeneity. So we are part of it. We just need to know more about it. It's not just the world after 1965, you know, the Immigration Act that opened up the America to the model minority Asians, you know, the Asians that were allowed back in, or allowed in so-called legally, because they had these skills that America wanted or needed. But it's not 1965 only. We get blinded to 1965, and we don't think about that very early, our very early entanglement in colonization. Even the New Orleans group, the Filipinos who were in New Orleans, the Manila men, think we should think about them, you know, 18th century, I believe that was. But anyway, it's a long history of Asians in America, and we need to keep learning about it. We need to keep reading the stories about it, buying the stories, borrowing those books to know more and be more adept at resistance.
We're almost at time, but I have one more question for me. What books do you teach your students?
I teach a lot of different books because I teach 9th grade to 12th grade. So I teach all across the board. I teach a lot of books. Some of the books that I love to teach are those where I say, Not knowing is really important. The skill of not knowing, the skill of recognizing what you don't know. Right now, I'm teaching A Mercy by Toni Morrison in a sophomore class. I'm teaching James Baldwin's The Devil Finds Work, which is about movies, how he as a child grew up watching these white movies and what it meant to him. And he goes and looks at the figures of the Black figures in those movies. There's a lot of Sidney Poitier in there. And thinks about the brown and Black. So I'm thinking about the brown and Black reader and art viewer in this white Western world, and how one centers that body. In that, I want my students to kind of see what that centering might mean. So I'm having them read Baldwin there, and after that, they're going to read The Sympathizer, Viet Thanh Nguyen's A Sympathizer, to move from the African experience into the experience of colonization and imperialism, and to have them really learn about Marxism. So, and then in another class, once again, I'm teaching 3 books in tandem. Oh, actually 4. Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, along with Heart of Darkness, along with Ellison's Invisible Man, along with John Keane's Counter Narratives. So these, and you can tell from these books, these are books that I read. I've read recently, I didn't read Ellison in the Philippines, and obviously John Keane is very contemporary. But I love John Keane; he's such a great writer. So those are some of the books I'm teaching my students. I really try to teach authors of color as much as I can.
I would have loved to be in your classes as a teen. Oh my God.
They're fun. These are fun classes. There was one class I was supposed to teach world literature. I only taught women.
So let's get to some questions from the audience. There is one question from Candy. Let's see. Writing in English, in a way you are writing in translation in the language of the colonizer, so to speak. How do you navigate this?
I will say this. For me, the question of English is a question of, it's not my question. I grew up with this language. I grew up under the violence of colonization. And even though my actual experience, if you think about it, my individual life, the personal life, let's say the Preemie life, is just one of reading, fun, happy, joy. I did not have as Preemie says, I did not have a terrible childhood. And so when I talk about the violence of English and what it is, it's just recognizing that I grew up in this space where I had to learn in English, but it was something that was given to me. So I did not create this situation. Someone else did, So it is my situation. So the way I deal with it is that it is mine. It is the kind of learning and language I grew up with, and I grew up with that in my body, and my body really matters. So I do center myself in the use of English. So I see the use of English. I always problematize the use of English in my books. If anyone reads my books, they're always talking about, there's so many puns. I have to always think about, the other way of reading that word, another way of reading that sentence. And that's because I'm always problematizing the language of English in my novels. And I think that's fun. And I think it's a very Filipino way of dealing with it, which is to be very, very, very aware of language. I grew up so aware of language, and I'm sure any Filipino would be able to tell you that, because you have to keep moving from one language into another. I mean, I moved from Waray to Cebuano to Tagalog to English to, I had to learn Spanish. I had to learn some Latin as well, because I had an older education, and it was normal. It was natural. So I just see the language of the colonizer as just part of one of my many different languages. And I navigate it by saying, fuck you. This is the world you gave me. I will do what I can to make you see my world.
All right, another question from Andrian, I hope I said your name right. Why do you think Filipinos are seen as resilient? Is religion a big part of that?
Religion could be, and even the Filipino religion, the way we've taken on Catholicism, really does have a lot of animist, old style type of thinking around it. You know, my mom was very fetishistic in the way she thought about saints and the Virgin Mary, like you had to really touch them, and they're very, you know, so it was almost like worshiping the thing itself, you know, the statue itself, as opposed to something more idea based. So definitely there's something about the religion, maybe there's something also about the religion that's very violent and corrupt and really terrifying. um but I think there's something about, I don't know if I do, I really want to, yeah, I'll generalize. Filipinos, in my view, are very curious and very open. That's the way I see and it's a huge strength of the Filipino. Even if you look at our resistors, Rizal and all of those people, they were very open to so many other cultures. Emilio Aguinaldo, the leader of the resistance movement against the Americans in 1899, he was already trying to learn English, which people will see as a problem, as a flaw, because he's moving into the colonizer's world. But no, he's also saying, I need to know this shit if people are trying to take my country. And also, so there's a kind of interesting openness to others that Filipinos have. At the same time that Filipinos center themselves in an absolutely narcissistic way. There's a narcissism in Filipinos' ways of doing religion even. So part of the resilience might be, and I don't know if resilience is the term, I think I would say the way Filipinos understand center is to understand multiplicity, which is also easy to colonize them, but it's also very hard actually to destroy them.
Okay, let's see. We have a few more questions in the chat. Emily is asking, are there other Filipino novelists you think American readers should pick up?
There are very, very many Filipino novelists. There are many YA novelists. There are many poets. I can think right now the poet Patrick Rizal. Patrick Rizal is such an education in Filipino history and culture and art. So he has his new and selected book of poems has just come out. Among novelists, obviously, I think a lot of Filipinos here may have read Elaine Castillo's America's Not the Heart. But among those that people have not really read, I would say pick up But for the Lovers by Wilfrido Noliedo. Wilfrido Noliedo is a writer of the 50s into the 70s. I think the 70s would be more. 1970. So this first novel of his was published by Dutton in 1970. It was republished by Dalkey Archives in like 1990s or something. And it is a beautiful work that centers on the Second World War, actually. The Battle of Manila in 1945. But it is an unheralded work that is absolutely astonishing in American literature and Filipino literature. I think it is very much part of American literature, as he was an immigrant to the United States. But it is absolutely astonishing that it is not seen in the country. But for the Lovers. So that's Wilfrido Noliedo. Penguin Classics has several works by Filipinos, obviously. Nick Joaquin's collection, I think that's a great book to look at. And there's so many others right now. I think there's currently, just this month, there was Daphne Palacio Andreades who came up with Brown Girls. That's a new book that's out. There is Jacob Guanzon's Abundance that was recently, it actually was shortlisted, I think, for the National Book Award. So there are many different Filipinos.
And I think we have a final question. I think we have time for one more question. This one's from Giselle. Dr. Rizal was executed for sparking a revolution with his book. Have you or do you feel afraid writing against the oligarchy taking hold of the Philippines?
The oligarchy doesn't read. They're a fairly illiterate bunch. So there's no huge fear with the oligarchy. They're not afraid of actually they are very afraid of Maria Ressa. They are afraid. There's a lot of fear, I imagine, with writers who go against them. I know that I have a lot of friends who actually have been told you better watch out, blah 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 blah. It's interesting. For instance, I would think that my novels, some people would be annoyed. And so once I actually rejected a prize that they were giving me, some honor that they were giving me during the Duterte regime, I said, no, I'm not accepting that during the Duterte regime. You know what they did? They still had a public awarding of the honor to me without me there. And this is the co-optation that governments do, you know. So it's a cat and mouse game, I think, with governments. No, I'm not afraid.
Okay. Thank you so much, Gina. We really appreciate you spending time with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
It was so good to talk to you.
So good to
I didn't get a chance to talk
so
to you
good
like
to
last
be
time.
here with all of you.
In closing, I'd also like to say thank you to our hosts, Dr. Nicole Cook, the University of South Carolina's Augusta Baker Endowed Chair, Publishers Weekly, and Penguin Random House Library Marketing. And finally, a very special thank you, library and publishing friends, for joining us today. The webinar recording will be available later, and we hope that you'll join the next AAPI Communities in Conversation that'll be on March 1st with Sue Yang Peace of Las Vegas Clark County Library District and guest authors Sarah Desai and Jen Frederick. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, librarians. I love librarians. They're my favorite.